Welcome, everyone. I'm calling this meeting to order, the Black Creek Oyster Bay Services Committee for Monday, October 16th, 2023. Just so anybody in the gallery, I don't see anybody in the gallery, so we're going to go through the details of where the muster points are, the washrooms, all the critical things here at the RD building. But first of all, I'd like to do the recognition of traditional territories and that we are meeting and doing our business today on traditional and ceded territory of our Comox First Nation friends. Resolution status report is our very first item of on the agenda. So motion to receive that if possible. Okay, I'll second it. Any discussion on the report?
No discussion. Thank you.
No discussion. Okay, so that's great. So anyone opposed to receiving? Hearing none, the resolution status report is received. On to UBCM Community Emergency Preparedness Fund application. There's a report here from October 10th regarding seeking approval to apply to the Union of BC municipalities for the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund grant for the Oyster River Fire and Rescue Department for the fire department equipment for receipt.
Move receipt.
Move receipt and seconded. And I see we have someone online. I'll turn it over to our acting CAO for introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. I'd like to introduce Bruce Green, Regional Rural Fire Chief and Fire Chief of the Oyster River Fire Rescue. So Bruce, I think you're going to be introducing the staff report on the UBCM Preparedness Fund.
Yes. Thanks, James. Just making sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So through the chair to the director and the board, this year, again, we're going to be applying for the UBCM Emergency Preparedness Fund to help train and supply our firefighters with equipment. We did apply for this grant last year, and we were successful in getting a propane tank that helps us do our live fire training, a couple SCBAs, a whole pile of coveralls to help them for the firefighters to wear for wildfire and around the fire hall. This year, we're looking at doing more training. The biggest one ticket item we're looking at is getting a forcible entry training prop, lots of fire officer one training, and other miscellaneous equipment. The biggest one being some more high volume hose, which is $1,000 for 100 feet. So we're looking at using this grant to offset the cost that we would be to replacing all this equipment. And I think it should be noted also that as Oyster River Fire Rescue oversees Merville and Mount Washington, we'll be training their firefighters as well, and their firefighters respond with Oyster River. So it's going to be beneficial for us, the Black Creek Oyster Bay area as well. With that, I ask if there's any questions.
Any questions from the director? No questions. Well, my question is, are we going for the whole enchilada, all 30K? So we're applying for 30 grand?
Yeah, I think Oyster River is applying for 29,300. I think Merville is for 30,000 and Mount Washington is for 30,000.
Okay, that's great. And once again, thanks for all your hard work on this. So we're on receipt. Any further questions? I don't have any questions, so I'll call the questions on receipt. Anyone not in favor? No one opposed? That carries. We have a recommendation.
I would move a recommendation.
I'll second that. It's moved and seconded on the recommendation. Seeing no further discussion. All those in favor? That carries. On to number 3, comprehensive rate review. The Black Creek Oyster Bay Water Local Service Area, a report providing a summary of the comprehensive rate review process, work completed to date, and recommended changes to the water rates for the BCOB for receipt.
Move receipt.
Move receipt. I'll second that and over to CAO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chris LaRose, our Senior Manager of Water and Wastewater Services, will introduce staff on this staff report as well as on the second staff report here on the agenda. So, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, James, and through the chair. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time today. We prepared a presentation to help walk us through a significant amount of detail, or not detail, information coming out of our comprehensive rate review that was completed this year, and presenting the recommended path forward. So the material presented today summarizes the more detailed information that was provided at the September 26th joint Black Creek Oyster Bay Electoral Area Services Committee workshop on this topic. All information presented at the workshop and today can be found in more detail in the attached staff report and attachments. So the rate review has been a long time coming and is the outcome of a large amount of planning done since 2018 involving engineering and finance here at the CVRD. We're very cognizant of the significant impact that increasing rates will have on our ratepayers. And we've worked very hard to ensure that the recommendations that are brought forward today represent the best path forward for these services. So it was clear when we first started receiving preliminary results from our asset management planning in 2018 and 2019 that the water local service areas managed by the CVRD are behind when it comes to funding infrastructure replacement, just given where we are at in our life cycle for our infrastructure. And this was confirmed in the results that were shared with the committees in 2019 when the asset management plans for these services were brought forward. The COVID pandemic driven delay to that rate review and following up on the asset management planning with this rate review was unfortunate because it has kind of further exacerbated the situation, but very necessary. The required rates are significant, and the decision was made not to further stress the community that was struggling to cope with the impacts of the pandemic at that time. But as you'll see from the presentation, all is not lost. We've on the next few slides, we'll show you that we still have time to turn this around and ensure the service is sustainable into the future. So this has been a significant interdepartmental effort with significant support from finance. I will be sharing the presentation this morning with Lucy from finance, myself and Zoe from engineering. And please stop us anytime if you have a question. Although I'm cognizant this is not the first time you've seen the information. So first, starting off with just to summarize the key objectives for this comprehensive rate review. So the first one, as I mentioned in my preamble, is sustainable service delivery. We're intent on managing these services in a way that ensures their sustainability into the future. And the reason we're here is because the scale of the asset replacement that is facing these services is, without corrective action in terms of revenue for the services, it does threaten the sustainability of the service. So the path forward that we're presenting today is geared to turn that around and ensure that we're collecting sufficient revenue to allow the service to replace assets owned by the service when they need to be replaced, to ensure that we can continue to provide the essential service, the essential water service that we're here to do. The second objective is to accomplish the first one, but in a way that minimizes the impact of the rate increases on the community. So as you'll see, the scenarios that are brought forward are kind of permutations of how quickly do we increase rates, and we're just going to make very clear what the relative impacts of those scenarios are. And then third is working towards an optimal balance of borrowing and reserves. So that's part of achieving the first. So part of achieving the sustainable service delivery for this service is at some point in the future, after we have fully implemented the outcome from asset management and the rate review, is that we will have an optimal balance of borrowing and reserves. So borrowing will always have a place, in order to buffer, because the replacement of our assets doesn't happen in a smooth function, as you'll see when we show you some of these graphs of the asset replacements. So borrowing does help. It does have a place for helping to smooth out the impacts. But as much as possible, we want to make use of reserves to minimize the cost of borrowing. And then finally, achieving fairness between current and future users. So not front-ending increases in such a way that they cause too much pain now, but also not deferring costs and making decisions that maximize borrowing in the future. Next slide. So just briefly, the process that we've followed in undertaking asset management and the rate review. So the first step was with the asset management planning in 2018 and 2019. So a complete asset inventory and management plan for this service. And so that, like I said, it was brought forward in 2019. We then developed work this year, started actually in 2019, and then finished the work this year to develop a long-term financial plan with the use of a software package called Waterworth, which is focused, tailor-made for helping water services do exactly what we're doing here. Then using that financial plan to model the revenue requirements for the service, which was a key kind of output for this work. And then use that to determine the cost impacts to users through a variety of scenarios. Then we updated and engaged with the directors. So that took place on September 26th, the workshop, where we received valuable input from the directors to help us craft the recommendations that are coming forward to you today. And then, assuming we proceed, the recommendation is approved today, then next step would be to engage with the public through information sessions I'll touch on a subsequent slide. And then we would input the asset replacement schedule into our financial plan, and then amend the bylaws to enshrine the required rate increases to parcel tax and user rates. So just very briefly, from an asset management perspective, so what's been done? So the first key step to asset management is developing an awareness of what you have in terms of assets. So that's recorded into an asset inventory. So that was done in 2018, 2019. And then part of that is it outputs a replacement schedule. So that graph at the bottom left shows kind of the raw output from that process, which just shows the expenditures for asset replacement occurring at the end of their life. As you'll see, we have then subsequently converted that into a more kind of smoothed out, realistic graph that reflects kind of the actual way in which assets are replaced, which takes into account their criticality and risk and condition. And so further to that, the graph on the right, or the map on the right, shows a small section of our distribution system that's color coded based on criticality and risk. So in the future, assets will be replaced based on their criticality and condition. So not all at once at the 60-year mark, and only when required. The last piece there is that a large significant recommendation coming out of the asset management planning was implementation of our computerized maintenance management system, which is largely complete for water, and a decision support software which will be scoped and delivered over the next couple of years for this system. And I'll pass you over to Lucy to talk about another key element of this work.
All right, good morning. No worries. Thank you. Good morning, directors. So I'm just going to speak briefly to the two pieces of policy, draft policy, that have gone into this utility rate review. So they are being the draft asset management policy, and secondly, the water services reserve policy. So what you have up here on the slide is the identified principles associated with both. The asset management policy and the reserve policy are two of what ideally will be about 4 or 5 pieces of governance included in a specific umbrella for water services fiscal foundations. Staff will build out other elements of this fiscal framework specifically for water services to the future. So as a priority, staff are in the process of implementing fully an asset management policy. The AM policy is intended to cover all CBRD business and services, just not specifically just for water services. The steering committee is guided by asset management best practice, and it's a steering committee that will be considering this draft policy over the coming month. And our hope is to bring that forward and have endorsement later this year into January of this year. Okay, we've developed this draft policy from research of what the most recently created and adopted AM policies are within the province, and it's aligned to Asset Management BC. The purpose of an asset management policy is to establish responsible governance for the practice of asset management. It documents the CVRD's commitment to asset management and the continuous improvement of the asset management program. It defines guiding principles for the development and integration of the asset management program. And finally, it delineates roles and responsibilities for the delivery of an asset management program. So within the policy, the very first principle speaks to priority-based decision-making, establishing a method based on trade-offs between level of service, life cycle costs, and risks, that it's clear, consistent, and transparent. Also, the principles speak to the CVRD's commitment to sustainable service development, sustainable service delivery. It indicates that appropriate tools, human resources are available, and that there's sufficient financial resources in place. The AM program supports the board's driver for climate crisis and environmental stewardship, and will endeavor to always improve by ensuring that we are tracking and communicating our progress. So regarding the reserve policy, and those principles are there on the right side, taking the time at the onset of this utility rate review process to establish guidance to the management of reserve levels was necessary. So a reserve policy's purpose is to ensure that board principles are in place for the appropriate oversight and planning of water reserves. Also to align for the availability of those financial resources necessary to maintain a viable, sustainable service that provides safe, reliable water to homes, and to protect the water services from unforeseen events. Included in the reserve policy, we have 7 principles. The first one we're all aware of, that reserves are established by service. Secondly, it sets parameters in place where the necessary financial resources are available as needed to keep operations going and to fund a responsible level of asset renewal without having to obtain unsustainable levels of debt. Reserve balances also are planned to mitigate risk for those unexpected events like we've seen over the last 5 years in COVID. The policy ties very closely into the asset management policy with the principle of obligations over assets. And as always is the case, we must consider balance and affordability for the taxpayer. Principle 6 and 7 just puts down in writing the intent of reserve types and when and how they'll be used and the authority for the reserves. And that's all I have for you on these 2 policies. So I'll pass it back over to Chris and Zoe.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
And yeah, so Zoe will take us next, and she has 3 slides to present the results from our rate review and the recommended path forward. And then I'll close off with 2 slides regarding communications and the next steps. Over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Chris. So for each of our water local service areas, there's 2 kind of key components that have come to be, informing those rates moving forward. And one of those pieces is the asset replacement schedule. So as Chris mentioned in the previous slide, with the work completed in 2019 with AECOM, we developed this asset management plan that included kind of a high level schedule of all of our assets, when are they needing replacement based on kind of year and service life. Within this kind of AECOM asset management plan, there's a couple of key things where the assets weren't really distributed over time. So most of our system for BCOB was installed in the 1980s and is asbestos cement pipe, which has roughly a 60-year service life, meaning that in this kind of top graph, a lot of these assets are coming up for replacement right out of this 20-year time frame in 2039, 2040, and we need to plan for that kind of now. As you can see, what we've done is taken that asset management plan and turned it into a long-term asset replacement schedule, this graph on the bottom. And this kind of distributes that asset replacement over a period of time, acknowledging that we're not going to replace all of our assets in the same couple of years, and that some assets can, be extended past that useful service life as they're lower risk or in better condition, but some might fail sooner and need to be replaced before that kind of 2040 timeframe when we see that major spending hump. So this long-term asset replacement schedule was one of the key inputs into the rate review. And we looked at a 40-year timeframe, so that kind of from now until 2062, that's to cover that first asset replacement kind of spending hump. As like I mentioned, most of our assets in Black Creek Oyster Bay are water mains, and they're all kind of installed in around the same time in the 1980s and are coming up for replacement in that kind of 2040 time period. The second piece of the asset or the rate review was the development of the long-term financial model. And this was, we used a tool called Waterworth, which takes all the different components and puts it together to help you kind of model your water rates. And there was a number of key kind of baseline assumptions that we used when we developed this model. So you can see here in the dark blue, that's our operating expenses. So this is based on our current financial plan. And as we move out past that 5-year financial plan, we're inflating all of our operating expenses at 2.5% per year. The next kind of component here is you can see this dark, medium green color with the big spending hump. That's all of our capital improvements. So that's all of our asset replacement schedule converted from that last slide. And then we have a couple other things happening here. So we have this dotted red line at the bottom that's speaking to kind of that minimum reserve balance and tying into Lucy's reserve policy. Same with this black line is kind of our target perfect world where we'd have our reserve balances resting. We then have had to use a large amount of debt for this service to kind of cover this first spending hump. So that's shown in the pink up here. And for all debt, we've assumed any debt occurring in the next 10 years is 4.4% interest, and then past that is 3.5%. In addition, we're inflating those capital improvements at 3% per year for those future years. So what this means is we have a total asset replacement cost over the next 40 years for the service of 75 million, and we're proposing to use 51.8 million in debt. So that's an average percent borrowing of 69% debt for these projects. And you can see this kind of turquoisey blue color is the future debt servicing costs for the service. So all of these pieces have come together in kind of how we, develop and make those rates moving forward. And what this means for the Black Creek Oyster Bay service. Oh, sorry, two other things I'd like to just mention here. So there's two other kind of assumptions here is we're assuming that there's no growth for the Black Creek Oyster Bay service, so that we're not accounting for any growth. If there is growth within the service, that'll just kind of help the economies of scale. And the primary reason for that is we see most of the growth in the service is kind of infill, and the options for infill development are, starting to slow. And the other piece is that there's no declining water consumption. So an option within the Waterworth model is previously, a lot of with better efficient fixtures was the option to kind of see the per capita consumption starting to decrease for homes. As we looked at our actual kind of per capita consumption for BCOB, we're not seeing that kind of decline in water consumption like some other local governments are. So we're not assuming any per capita consumption decline. So for the BCOB service, this slide kind of just summarizes the recommended rates. Currently, the average Black Creek Oyster Bay user consumes 243 cubic meters of water a year and has a frontage of about 100 feet. So one other piece for BCOB is the only service we have that has a frontage tax instead of a parcel tax. And as part of this process, we're also proposing to convert that frontage tax to a parcel tax to bring it in line with the other services. This is kind of twofold, for parcel tax. The primary portion of the parcel tax is there's two parts to our rates, the user rates and the parcel tax. And the user rates are intended to cover the operating and maintenance costs for the service. And the parcel tax is intended to cover the asset replacement costs for the service. So converting from a frontage tax to a parcel tax just ensures that, that the all properties within the service are kind of paying an equal amount to contribute to future asset replacement costs is there's more than just water mains in the service. There is treatment and wells and those types of infrastructure so that everyone's paying fairly into that. So for the average BCOB user, they currently pay $545 annually. And the recommended rate increases include user rates increasing at 2.5% per year. And this is just matching inflation. And then the parcel tax increasing as follows shown below. So increasing the parcel tax over a 10-year time period, increases over 5 years, have the most upfront pain, but have a long-term gain in the fact that they, the overall rate increases over the next 15 years are actually the least, where the 15-year parcel tax has the most gradual increase. However, the kind of total increase over that 15-year time period is the greatest. And the 10-year parcel tax increase kind of strikes the balance in the middle. So the recommendation within the report today is to proceed with increases for the Black Creek Oyster Bay service per scenario 2, which would be the user rates at the 2.5% per year and a 10-year increase to parcel tax. And I will pass you back over to Chris for the last couple of slides.
Thank you, Zoe. So from a communications perspective, as summarized in the presentation, these are while we think we found working together with the directors through the September 26th workshop, we think we found a good balance here. They are still significant increases, and we've clearly identified the need to work closely with the public to make sure they understand, why and when. Because of the critical nature of this work, we haven't identified many opportunities for consultation. So I think the focus here with the planned communications approach is very much an information. So letting the public know why and when. So why these rate reviews, why the rate review was completed, what the results are, and when to expect the increases. So the first contact point, other than for those watching the meeting today, or potentially catching the recorded presentation, would be the November 14th electoral areas meet and greet. That'll occur here in this room. So we'll be including an element regarding the rate review in that event. And then we'll also be sending out a direct mail to each affected property owner. So every property within the Black Creek Oyster Bay service will receive a direct mail with some information and an invitation to attend the information session that will occur in late November at the Oyster River Fire Department. And then finally, next steps. So as I just mentioned, November information sessions so if the recommended approach is supported today, then the next step would be to bring forward the first, second, and third reading of the required bylaw amendments to embed the changes to parcel tax and user rates. So they are in place early in the new year. And then the fourth reading would be brought back to the December 12th board after the November information session. And we've had a chance to collate any feedback received. And then January Inspector of Municipality approval, implementation of the parcel tax increases, and then embedding these rate changes into the financial plan, the proposed financial plan that will be approved in March. Right, sorry. Zoe just reminded me, so we have two of these presentations this morning, one to the Black Creek Oyster Bay and one to the Electoral Area Services Committee. So this service doesn't actually require an increase to the maximum requisition. So that's a correction to this slide. So it does require a bylaw amendment, but because the maximum requisition within the service establishment bylaw is higher than in some of the other services, a change to the max rec is not required. So these changes will be finalized at that fourth reading of the bylaw at December 12th, and then embedded within the financial plan. Apologies for that. So that's all we have for you this morning, but happy to answer any questions or support discussion.
Boy, you guys are sure lucky this isn't an election year. That's all I gotta say. Director, you got some questions?
Yes, I've got quite a few questions. First of all, I am quite happy to see that there's going to be a review every 4 years. I like to see that that review is coming a year after the elections. So I think that that's very important. Takes a lot of time for people to come up to speed with all of this. So I'm happy to see that. One thing I am kind of concerned about is the policy around asset replacement. I'm noticing from my own experience working in local government that a lot of local governments are looking at 15-year and 20-year models on asset replacement. So I'm wondering why this particular service, considering the enormous cost of replacement, you're only looking at a 10-year.
10 years. So where are you seeing the 10-year?
Well, it just seems to me that, you started this process in 2019. We're 3 years into it. You're just coming up with a policy now. And now we're looking at collecting enough parcel tax over a 10-year period. As I said, a lot of local governments are realizing that a 10-year model, particularly when we're looking at infrastructure replacement, doesn't cut it. So a lot of local governments are looking at 15 and 20-year because we know, again, full well that it's the taxpayers that are paying this.
Understood. Yes. Correct me if I'm misunderstanding the question, but so we've actually, as summarized by Zoe, we've actually looked out 40 years in this case. And so that the three scenarios that we've brought forward for analysis through the rate review, we're looking at how quickly do we increase the revenue to meet the required asset replacement cost. Right. So we brought the 5, 10, and 15-year. We're recommending a 10-year rollout, but we're looking out much farther than that in terms of understanding what's coming. So
yes, that answers partially, but
yeah.
What I'm looking at is that already the infrastructure only has X amount of life.
Yeah.
And we're quickly coming on that. So again, my question is, why wasn't this process started a bit sooner, knowing full well that you can predict what is the asset end of life? And we're cutting, and in my mind, we're cutting it a bit short. We could have started this process 5 years ago, gently increased, and probably would be in a better position. And that's what I'm trying to say is that a lot of local governments are looking at that going, when we're looking at very large infrastructure replacements, we do need to start looking at those sooner than later.
I fully agree, and I acknowledge that in my preamble to the presentation that we're very late in the game for this. So, in fact, our preference is to best practice is actually to look at asset replacement from year one. Mm-hmm. You put an asset in, you understand exactly what the cost, what the cost impact in terms of depreciated value per year should be for the life of that asset. Yeah. So not just 15 years out for a 60-year lifespan. The reality is that that's not where we are. So we are now in a position where we are about between 10 to 20 years out from the bulk of these replacements. As I highlighted, we started this process in 2018 and did intend to complete the comprehensive rate review the following year after the asset management plan was brought forward. Circumstances intervened. If we had proceeded, we would have been 4 or 5 years ahead, mm-hmm. and the situation would be a little better. So there's no doubt that that delay has impacted the scale of and speed of the rate increases.
And I think that that's something that, again, when we talk about communication to the residents, I mean, we need to be very clear with that communication that, again, I'll leave it at that, but I think I've made my point that, in regards with asset management, I do think that it is more prudent to be looking at it from a much longer lens in terms of replacement, so that these costs, when we have to go back and communicate with our constituents, aren't going to be such a hit. And when I take a look at, the 10-year model, I know that that's not bad, but when I'm also taking a look at it, is that there's going to be a lot of other factors in that 10 years. That's still a fair hefty increase for people to take a look at. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Director. I would mention, though, that I'm very heartened to see a director across the table who is so progressive in their thinking, and it wasn't always so There was different dynamics at this table for the last 20 odd years. So yeah, it's that may have been one of the factors why we didn't move ahead on a lot of issues. I think you know what I mean. But my question is around emergency management. So we've seen in the Comox Valley water system, we've had quite a few surprises. So I know it's great for man to sit back and plan, but God laughs the whole way. So we don't know when something's going to suddenly gusher out of the ground and force our hand on this. So you know, obviously we look in the crystal ball, and this is what we imagine we can do. But you know, I would think that there may be an accelerated water main replacement or something in our horizon. Am I correct with that? We never quite know about that. So the unknown unknowns, or the known unknowns, I guess.
Yeah, you know, we can only plan for what we, you know, can anticipate at this point in time, and you're absolutely correct that that circumstances could change. So we could have a major seismic event that could shorten the life, to say the least, of many of our assets. So I think, you know, that, but it is hard to plan for that. You know, we're doing everything we can to identify those assets that are most critical. When they're replaced, they will be replaced in such a manner to make them more resilient to such events. And we are, I guess, fortunate in that way. A bit of a silver lining that we are approaching the end of life for many of these assets. So, you know, within a relatively short period of time, 10 to 20 years, the bulk of our assets will be replaced and much more resilient to those types of impacts.
Thank you very much. I don't want to belabor this. We have to move on. So, Lucy has something to add. Lucy.
Thank you, Chair Graves. Just super quickly, but just wanted to just call attention to that is one risk that we're facing in the current situation right now. From the perspective of we don't have enough reserves in our bank account at the moment. So part of the reserve policy is to be addressing that element of risk. Very difficult to do so when we're considering affordability to the taxpayer right now, and you see us move to a recommendation for increasing slowly over the 10 years. But what that also means is that we've only been able to address the immediate needs and not necessarily go to the place where we're collecting money to mitigate risks. So as we get better to the future, we'll keep considering these pieces. Putting your policies in place is a way to ensure that those pieces are here as endorsed governance. And as we go forward, it becomes a model for this table and guidance for staff as we move forward with our planning to ensure that we are addressing elements of risk to the future so we can be better protected.
Totally understood. Director, you have something to add?
Just going to add to that, that is one of the things that I've noticed in my first year is that there's always been the belief that we're doing ourselves a favor by holding back on tax requisition when quite often we're not. So I'm not opposed to, you know, increase in tax requisition when it makes sense, particularly when we can pick up some good cash reserves, knowing full well that that is a service that we may have to draw on those sooner than later. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and there's a difference between nice to haves and need to haves. This is a need to have. Okay, that brings us to receipt. I'm going to call the question. Anybody opposed to receipt? That carries. And the recommendation.
I would move recommendation.
I second it. Any further discussion on the recommendation? Seeing none, call the question. All in favor? And that carries. Number 2, Black Creek Oyster Bay Local Service Area Connection Suspension. Quickly and briefly, over to Chris.
Thank you, through the chair. So yeah, the staff report on the agenda recommends lifting the connection suspension that's been in place since October of 2021. So that connection suspension was put in place due to the kind of lower than expected production capacity of the previous well that was installed. And at the time, there was a lot of development happening and anticipated. And staff were quite concerned about our ability to guarantee water supply during the kind of increasing summer droughts. Since that time, there's been a number of kind of pieces of progress that have, in a nutshell, made staff more confident in the system. The first one is that we have secured a kind of rights to land or to drill drinking water wells in land adjacent to our existing treatment plant outside of the zone of influence of the river. And so these are been secured through negotiation with the Shelter Points Farm. And the second one is that we have progressed significantly on installation of the first well. We've including testing of a test well at that location, which confirms that projects that the well should be able to produce more than what was expected from preliminary study work. And while the progress towards completion of that well is still in progress and not expected to be complete until mid to late next year, it has definitely made staff more confident. And then finally, there was a significant amount of analysis that was part of the water master planning process complete early this year, including a more detailed assessment of our water sources and how they can be combined to supply water during drought years. So the suspension was critical to help us mitigate the risk at the time. It spot us time to progress development of additional sources and gain a better understanding of the system. But at this point, given the ongoing impact to the community of the connection suspension in place and the added confidence that we have in the system and where we're going, we are recommending that the connection suspension be lifted. We're happy to answer any questions about this recommendation.
Thanks, Chris. Director?
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments that, again, I noticed that First Nations in Area D are not being engaged. So I think probably the best way for me to bring that to this board's attention is that I'll contact the SRD and I'll bring a motion there for our First Nations committee to reach out. I think it's important if we're going to engage First Nations that we engage them all. The other thing that I do want to just mention is that I'm happy to see that potentially this suspension can be lifted. I know that there's been a lot of concern on my side of the river in terms of the availability of water. So I think that this is quite important. Thank you.
Yes, well said. I second that for sure. A lot of people have been waiting for this. I think we did the right thing on erring on the side of caution, and even though that we didn't see there's no runaway growth, as you say, we're not actually even planning for too much growth in the area that hasn't already been considered. Yeah, I'd like to move this forward if we can, because we do have one more item on the agenda. So if Chris wants to chime in with a little background on this, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, just one more point. Just wanted to highlight that that the consultation for the permitting process for the new well is more extensive in terms of First Nation engagement. So the First Nations in Campbell River in your area are being engaged in the permitting process. But
wasn't highlighted.
Yes, and that's definitely a gap on our end. So they are. So that is a provincially kind of driven and kind of guided process. And so as part of that process, they do cast a kind of wider net in terms of consultation. So I wanted to reassure you that that is occurring. That being said, on our end, our focus has been on engaging directly with the Comox First Nation. So potentially there's some room for improvement there. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, the process is seldom over, is it? So, okay. We're on receipt. Call the question on receipt. All in favor? And the recommendation?
I move a recommendation.
I'll second that. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? That carries. And if I can indulge the committee to consider one more, the comprehensive rate. Oh no, where are we at? Yeah, we are. Comprehensive rate review, Black Creek Oyster Bay Water Local Service Area report for receipt.
Move receipt.
Seconded. Over to staff on this, or do we have any further questions on it? Pardon? Yeah. So we just move the motion.
I think Lisa, was it the second recommendation there? There's two recommendations. Yeah, and so on the screen there, you can see there's two recommendations noted. The first one was moved and approved.
Oh, sorry. So we just have the second,
Yeah,
which is the staff proceed with planning and completing the public information sessions with assistance of a contractor in the Black Creek Oyster Bay Local Water Service Area. This is relating to a meeting at the fire hall, et cetera, right in the hand and the mail outs and stuff. Okay.
that's right. Yeah.
Director John,
I would move recommendation.
I'll second that. Any further discussion? Seeing none around the table, all those in favor? That carries. No new business, no addendum, no media questions. No in camera, I'll entertain a motion for termination.
Yep.
Second. Okay, we're terminated. Thank you.